Excited to be here personally. We've got an exciting agenda. We're doing some really interesting work in this area of post-pandemic places. So hopefully you're going to be inspired, delighted, intrigued, and it's going to spark some new ideas. Hoping you're going to have lots of questions for us. So there'll be an opportunity to engage in discussion later on. We'll just give a couple more moments to let the hordes flood in. While we're waiting, why not? I'm going to put a poll up and see. I think it's always really interesting to know how many people are here for the first time and what part of the market or what sector, what kind of organization you're here from. So I'm going to put a poll up and we'll leave it up for a couple of minutes whilst people come in. Do tick to let us know. Is it your first time here or are you a regular? And where do you come from in the Connected Places market? Where do you see yourself? What role do you play? It's been quite exciting, the degree to which these events have gone international. Our Catapult has always been one that's prided itself on being global in its reach, because of course places are all over the world. And so it's been exciting that these, what were events that were just happening in our offices in East London, have now gone very much global. So hello to those of you who are dialing in from around the world to hear what's happening in the UK, in the UK innovation ecosystem. So that's good to hear. Okay, a couple more moments and we'll get started. Very good. Well, so as you can see from the screen, we've got three speakers today. We've got Richard Miller, who's one of our associate directors. He's an expert in innovation and in a strategy background, history in Innovate UK and elsewhere. So he's been working closely with us on the analysis that we're going to talk through, helping us explore it. And I've got two members of our team, Tamar, who heads up our data science and software development team, looking at some of the data and data modeling aspects of the current opportunity, and Bob, who heads up the market intelligence team lead, who's been holding the pen on a lot of this analysis. Now the results popped up and they disappeared. So trying to pop this back up, here we are. So great. Well, so lots of you are here for the first time. That's brilliant, 63%. So you're very, very welcome. It's always good to connect with new people. I'm glad that something that we've done has caught your imagination. I hope it proves a really interesting event. We've got, as usual, a really large mix of people: academia, consultancy and freelancing, a not-for-profit sector, lots of SMEs and others. So excellent. Hopefully a really rich discussion will follow based on that diversity of experience. So let's get started. As all of you will be eminently aware, we're at a time of amazing change and transformation. It's been a time of real challenge for many, both personally, individually, and as an economy and as businesses. But we also see huge opportunity at this time, and we see that there's great opportunity for innovation and new businesses to rise up and thrive, to help create the new world that we find ourselves living in. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We've been publishing analysis that we've been conducting over the last couple of weeks and months, which we hope you've been reading and have found useful. If you haven't yet discovered it, then make sure you go and visit those chapters of our innovation brief. They're available on our website and also on Medium, depending on your preference for reading platform. Very warm welcome as to those of you who haven't come across the Catapult before. We are a UK government-backed innovation agency tasked with growing the UK economy Our mission is to harness UK innovation to help create connected places for a greener, more prosperous, more productive future. And so we see this as a time of great opportunity. So Richard is going to give us a sort of 15-20 minute keynote to kick off, summarizing some of the key themes and ideas that have grown out of this analysis we've been doing. And then we will unpack and explore those with our panel. And as I say, hopefully lots of you will have questions, ideas, insights to share. So do get ready with your questions. If you're struggling with the Zoom link, we're broadcasting on YouTube as well. So do jump across there if you'll find that easier. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard.
Thank you very much, Sam. So just getting started, good. So thanks for the introduction. Today, we're talking about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on our villages, towns, and cities. And we're asking ourselves, what can the pandemic teach us about our future innovation needs? So coronavirus has turned our world upside down. We've seen cities across the world locked down, released, locked down again, supply chains have been disrupted, and economies brought to a standstill. UK output was cut by 20% in the last couple of months. Globally, there have been 12 million cases of COVID-19 and over 500,000 deaths. This has been a profound shock to our systems, and it requires a response. So what are we learning from the coronavirus pandemic about our innovation needs? We can think of the challenge in 3 horizons. Horizon 1 is the situation we're in right now, emergency response. We're looking down at our feet. What are our first steps? What direction do we go in? Horizon 2 is the gap between tight lockdown and having a long-term solution like a vaccine. As we try and get the economy and society working again, what do we need to do? And Horizon 3 is what happens next. What is the long term? What changes are required to conquer coronavirus or adapt to it? So starting with Horizon 1, what's been happening already? What have we already seen? There have been some profound and immediate changes. We've got used to seeing empty streets, little traffic, few pedestrians. We've seen panic buying across the world. Supermarket shelves stripped of staples. A surprising global passion for toilet paper. And yet, after the initial panic, the supply chain has responded. Food is available. We've not run out of medicines, and we can once again buy toilet paper. So we've found ways to keep people supplied with basic needs. And that's been helped by moving shopping rapidly online, with online orders and deliveries doubling in the UK since the outbreak. We started off with personal protective equipment in very short supply, and there was a scramble to find new sources. Now, large companies like Airbus were able to convert some of their production capacity for PPE, and 3D printers and distributed manufacturing proved their worth in bridging the gap. At the same time, we had individual volunteers stepping up to supply masks to people who needed them. We've also seen a dramatic rise in the use of contactless cards and payments as people wanted no-touch shopping. And there's been a dramatic and concerted global effort to find a vaccine. There's more than 150 live projects at the moment. The scientists and the medical profession have proved that under pressure they can move extremely fast, going through the stages of development and testing in months and not years. And of course, as people avoided public transport, we've seen a dramatic upsurge in active transport and mobility, particularly cycling. Pop-up cycle paths have been rapidly created all over the country on roads suddenly cleared of cars, vans, and trucks. And millions of people have discovered that they can work effectively from home. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of virtual meetings and events, just as we are doing today. These bring gains and losses. People are generally more productive working from home, but there are losses in the social contact with co-workers, and that can inhibit creativity and problem solving. So in the long term, we're not quite sure how well this is going to work. But faced with the need to control infection risk and maintain social distancing, the National Health Service in the UK has switched wholesale to online consultations, and it's found that they work surprisingly well. Telehealth has broken through many of the barriers that prevented its mainstream use. And the British Medical Association says that 90% of our general practitioners want to continue with online consultations. So despite initial problems, society and economies have responded remarkably well to these unprecedented challenges. Astonishing feats have been delivered, things that would never have been thought possible before coronavirus. The pandemic has shown us that many barriers to innovation are molehills masquerading as mountains. But this has come at a price. It's like an athlete going deep into the red, going into oxygen debt. It is not sustainable. We are stretching many systems and services beyond their capacity to deliver. The lactic acid is building up in society's muscles, and eventually we will no longer be able to go on. We will need to reorganize to recover, and that means new solutions and new ways of working, especially in the gap between strict lockdown and a long-term solution, what we've called Horizon 2. As we move into Horizon 2, we're working with our existing infrastructure. There's no time for significant upgrades. We have to work with what we've got. So we need to work out how to use what we have more effectively. To safely unlock, we must have reliable and universal test, track, and trace systems. For the moment, the best results seem to be in countries where there are relatively few concerns about privacy and where there are large human resources which can be thrown at the problem. It's still very much a human activity. And this raises too many questions for a long-term solution. We're going to need better, faster, more reliable testing, coupled with contract tracing, which is both efficient and acceptable. With many more people working from home, cybersecurity is going to be a huge issue. Excellent broadband access and speeds, secure cloud operations, and secure access will be needed for millions of people who've been previously office-based. Some sectors, such as finance, have relied on isolated networks and computer systems with strong firewalls to prevent penetration. Now they will have to use the internet. What products and services exist to help businesses, and what can be done to support individual workers, because they're the most likely security weakness? How do we do remote ergonomics and health and safety? How does a business discharge its responsibility to its workers? Is there an opportunity for a one-stop service to help new home workers create a practical and safe working environment at home? And how can we make socially distanced public transport work? Some of the big data tools, digital scheduling, booking, and occupation systems can make the best use of the reduced capacity we have. But people are not yet coming back to public transport in numbers, preferring cars if they have to travel. How do we make public transport economically viable through Horizon 2? We are seeing additions to active transport and micro-mobility options. The UK is now trialling rental e-scooters, adding them to e-bikes and city bikes, and many other cities around the world have a variety of solutions, all in an attempt to bridge the gap created by reduced public transport capacity. I think that no touch, no hands will be a powerful trend. Systems like this one from Ultraleap use ultrasound to create a field which senses hand gestures and the position of users' fingers. This can be used for contactless access control, use of pins, and operation of information kiosks. Face recognition is another method being used for access control. And we're likely to see thermal cameras becoming much more standard for checking for fever and temperatures and other COVID-19 symptoms. And what will happen to co-working spaces where people rent offices by the hour, have a membership system where they have a place they can go and work. Very popular with startups and SMEs. At the moment, they're having a horrible time with their business evaporating. But if they can survive, they may be winners. With a dramatic increase in working from home, many companies are abandoning permanent large offices and thinking about how to allow home working teams to get together for the regular meetings they require. And what will happen to offices? Will we return to the cube farm to provide separation and protection? It's not a very attractive proposition to me, but that's what's being talked about. Or will there be other innovative solutions to create safe workspaces, new designs and layout that can manage the infection risk? And whilst we're talking about office work, some things can be tweaked for safe working fairly easily. No hands access and control, one-way routes, desk spacing and screens. Other things are part of the building structure. We can't easily change ventilation systems to prevent the spread of droplets and aerosols. It's not just a matter of putting better filters in, it's a major, potentially structural upgrade. What is likely to happen in Horizon 2 is an acceleration of trends already visible. More working from home and less formal office space. More online shopping and less business for the high streets and for the shopping centres. More contactless payments and less cash. More concern about air quality and more interest in active travel, walking and cycling. One key question is whether some of the immediate pop-up changes will continue. The Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, plans a car-free future for the city, a long-term vision which is being accelerated by the coronavirus. But will it stick? All over the world, there are strong forces trying to make things go back to the way they were. As traffic builds again in many cities, will novice cyclists continue? Will they take what they see as the risk? Horizon 3 is the longer-term future. Here we need to think hard about fundamental parts of our infrastructure. As far as COVID-19 is concerned, there are two possible futures. In one, the problem is solved. We find a vaccine or achieve herd immunity, or the virus just fizzles out. In the other, COVID-19 persists, and we have to learn to live with it. It becomes endemic like flu. We develop treatments and maybe need annual vaccinations, and we have to restructure society to prevent or manage outbreaks. We all hope for a solution, but having to live with coronavirus long term is a real possibility. So which of the changes we're already seeing looks to be permanent, and what are the implications? The switch to online shopping has been dramatic and fast, taking an existing trend and accelerating it. What does that mean for our high streets? What use can the space be put to? How can we use the buildings? For many of our towns and cities, particularly in the UK, high streets are the focus of the community. How will that evolve? And even if many businesses do continue to use centralized offices, the trend to working from home will persist. But how do we accommodate that? Do people have the space to make the separation between family life and work that seems to be essential for well-being? Small houses, apartments, how will this work? Many people have commented on the trend towards shoebox homes in the UK, and this chart shows a 20% decline in the average size of new homes from the 1970s to today. Is that trend reversible? If not, how do we fit safe, comfortable, and acceptable working spaces into modern homes? It feels like there is a business opportunity there. And even with more of us working from home, there will still be larger shared buildings, offices, factories and warehouses, leisure and entertainment centers, and shopping centers. If the coronavirus is still around, these will need major changes to ventilation and other systems to avoid infection. How will we change the design of new buildings? And how will we retrofit existing buildings? Other changes may come from what people have experienced during the lockdown. This is the air quality in Milan before and after the lockdown. Once the public have experienced this improvement, will they accept to return to the old situation? If not, we will see a very rapid transformation of all forms of transport to ultra-low pollution, if not net zero and zero carbon. The existing trend towards electric vehicles could be dramatically speeded up. Alternative last mile delivery systems like this electronic cargo bike could take over from the huge numbers of white vans moving packages around our towns and cities. One way to maintain social distancing is to need fewer people for any given activity. There's already a trend for automation in industry. If we need socially distanced workplaces, robots and automation are one of the solutions. Fewer people, more spaced out. It's obvious that manufacturing industry can automate, but that can't be true of the service industries, can it? Well, Japan, with a stagnant and aging population, has been working for a long time on the use of robots in personal service. They've been particularly concerned about supporting older people and have been developing robot nurses, robot assistants, and robot pets to provide companionship. Is that what we are going to see happening in other parts of the world? PwC has studied the impact of robots and automation on the UK economy. They see three waves of change. First, wider use of AI, then automation, and then by the mid-2030s, autonomous systems. At the end of this, they see nearly 1/3 of jobs vanishing, particularly affecting non-graduates. If we have to live with coronavirus long term, this is another trend that could accelerate. So where does this leave us? There are innovation opportunities in each horizon. Horizon 1 is about the emergency deployment of existing solutions. The innovation will be in clever ways of combining solutions and finding new applications. In Horizon 2, we're still stuck with the infrastructure we have now. The challenge is to make the best use of it. That suggests digital innovation in the foreground as we work out how to reconfigure our assets. In Horizon 3, there are divergent scenarios depending on whether we get control of coronavirus or not. But in either case, we are likely to see investment in infrastructure to make it more suitable for new needs and the growth in automation. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. A brilliant synthesis of the opportunities and the trends across those different horizons, and lots to spark our thinking and our interest. So I'm going to invite the rest of our panel to join me. I invite those of you out in the audience to start sharing questions. What are the opportunities for innovation that you see? What are the greatest needs for innovation? What are the ways that behavior and demand is changing? Richard, you may need to stop sharing your screen. We're currently seeing your desktop.
Right. Yes. I've only got the narrow bar at the side and no controls.
Well, I'll carry on whilst you or the colleagues sort you out. So yes, what are the behaviours that you've seen over the course of the recent weeks and months that you think are going to shape new demand, where new innovation is needed? What has stood out from the innovation chapters that you've read, that we've been publishing?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so there's a huge range of different opportunities, I think, that are emerging, and Richard did a great job of giving a bird's eye view across them. Personally, I think the area that's maybe most interesting, because it brings together a sort of range of different and sometimes competing factors, is that of mobility. So as was talked about, we're seeing a reduction in public transport usage, obviously in the first instance due to lockdown, but secondarily due to concerns about contagion as lockdown lifts. And that we're seeing in some places. So for Wuhan, for example, saw a big uptick in private vehicle usage. So internal combustion engine vehicles, which is obviously not entirely what you would want to see. But those kinds of trends are also counterbalanced by some of the factors that Richard mentioned in his talk. So the lockdowns themselves drove significant improvements in air quality across our cities, And numerous surveys have been done which demonstrate that citizens noticed this and appreciated it and would like to sort of sustain those improvements. We also saw a big upswing in active mobility and people using those active modes for health benefits, both physical and mental health. And those are some habits that you would expect to be sustained for at least a proportion of the population after lockdown lifts and we start to transition out of it. We also seen an increase in the use of the electric micromobility solutions and a growth in sales of both personal scooters, electric bikes, and kits that you can actually use to adapt a normal bike to be an electric bike as well. So those are trends which are kind of butting up against, if you like, the other elements that I mentioned. So the kind of risks on the one side and then the countervailing trends themselves. But we also have to include in this mix, of course, governments and public policy interventions, which will be trying to sort of tip behaviours in a direction which is socially useful. And we're seeing that in the UK quite a lot. So there's a lot of initiatives around increasing and speeding up the transition to electric vehicles. There's the Rapid Charging Fund to try and ensure the rollout and availability of charging points for electric vehicles. We're seeing the Automotive Transformation Fund, which looks across the whole electric vehicle value chain, from battery technology through to drivetrain and all the rest of it, which is putting a lot of money and investment into developing those capabilities. We're seeing the trials of electric scooters and the pedestrianisation of streets that Richard mentioned as well. So all of this, I think, just demonstrates that markets, they don't exist in isolation. They're created by public policy, by governments in a way, and they're shaped by those things as well. So we're seeing, I think, in the mobility space, we're seeing both kind of organic demand, so for active mobility, for clean air, supported by government interventions in particular sectors that will be stimulating, hopefully, growth, particularly around electric vehicles. So this will offer opportunities across all of the areas, I would say. So all of the kind of supply chains for EVs. On the supply chain point, there's a big discussion as well about onshoring. So our global supply chains with lots of different links around the world, are they viable now in the COVID world? So there's a lot of discussion and potential efforts made around onshoring all the elements of supply chain for a complex product like that. We're also seeing, obviously, micromobility growing, so all of the hiring services. And also, I think a lot of these modes for mobility will be producing lots of data. So kind of data collection will be almost built into the modes themselves. And that will open up some really interesting opportunities, both for the monetization of that data and different business models for funding these things, but also extracting social value from them. So using those data and understanding how people are moving around, where they're moving around, to power things like policy interventions like dynamic road use charging, which is a way of charging for the use of streets and pavements, which varies based on the mode of transport that you're using. So all of this data will be able to demonstrate that you're using a green, eco-friendly mode of transport, and you'll be charged less to use that asset accordingly as compared to polluting vehicles. So in essence, I think there's a huge range of opportunities within the transport ecosystem, a lot of different stages, and really exciting, I would say.
Fantastic. Well, we've got a whole session, I think it's next week, I'm also hosting, called Avoiding Carmageddon, which is very much on that theme of making sure that we don't all just rush back to petrol vehicles, and what are the opportunities for alternative mobility. So if something in what Bob has said has sparked your interest, do sign up for that. But Bob, you talked about data, and I want to bring in Tamar. So Tamar, you head up our data science and software team. You've been working on some multi-agency data modeling projects as part of the kind of response phase to the pandemic. Do you feel like we're entering a more, are you hopeful, I suppose, for better use of data in decision making, or is this more of a blip?
I think I am overall hopeful. Thanks, Sam. And it's good to hear Bob describe the idea that we might have more data coming from these kind of new transport modes to feed some of the models that have been kind of created as part of the effort that you described, Sam. So we've been working as part of a Royal Society convened kind of collaborative exercise that's called the Rapid Assistance to Modelling the Pandemic. And it's really something that tries to draw on kind of really collaborative approaches across academia and industry to feed into government thinking, so to kind of directly affect the decisions that are being made around first kind of how we went into lockdown and how we're slowly coming out of that, how that might start to become slightly more localized and kind of nuanced in the way it's applied. So the data modeling efforts that have been part of that have kind of focused on two main themes. One is around smaller spaces, so thinking about things like supermarkets and train stations. So there are kind of computer models fed by data of kind of how people are actually moving through these spaces and interacting, and what interventions might be put in place to kind of control that movement to some extent and to make those places safer. And then at the kind of urban analytics scale, which is more looking at modeling disease transmission for like villages and towns and cities, and at that kind of level. So that work is in partnership with lots of different universities in the UK, includes the Alan Turing Institute, the data science kind of partnership and centre of excellence. And the collaboration is really across so many domains. It's such a nice example of multidisciplinary collaboration. And I think really that's just, COVID is a truly multidisciplinary problem. So we've seen epidemiologists working with transport modelers, working with kind of big retailers and employers, local authorities, and new collaborations forming due to this crisis, which I think can only be a positive thing in terms of our response to it. At the Catapult specifically, we've been thinking quite a lot about the reproducibility of some of these models. It's really important that we can reproduce science, and there's been quite a lot of discussion around this in the scientific community over the past few years. And when it comes to building kind of computer models, it's particularly important because these things can get quite complex quite quickly, and they're quite difficult to maintain. And it kind of involves lots of different skill sets to make them really kind of easy for someone else to kind of test out different scenarios and get the same results and make the same recommendations and therefore the same decisions. And that's kind of really critical for the credibility of the decisions made off the back of models. So yeah, I think that's one theme. I think I'm hopeful and starting to see things get a little bit better around local data in particular. So I think we're starting to acknowledge the importance of local action and local decisions and therefore local data. For example, the kind of things held by local authorities, which they've been using to identify vulnerable residents and to support those residents in a kind of targeted way. And I'm hoping that in the kind of medium-term horizon that Richard has described, we might increase our focus on those localized strategies. For example, when it comes to the deployment of vaccines and things like that, we need data sharing at a local level and the right stakeholders to have access to that data, so we can be strategic in the way that we deploy what ultimately will be limited resources. We've seen some problems with testing data being shared with local authorities and local GPs, and global data sharing, but also that local data sharing, I think, is really at the heart of our response to the pandemic. So it's critical that we get it right. And I think there are some really nice examples of it starting to happen, but we can do better.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we've got lots of questions from the audience. Thank you for sharing those. I'm going to come to some of these. There's one question here about outdoor dining. I think we shared in the report the fact that places like Vilnius and other places have been allowing their cafes and restaurants to spill out into the streets to enable social distancing on ground that would previously have been filled with cars. And it strikes me that as we return to offices, other workplaces, this challenge of how we create places that are both actually safe and feel safe. I think you touched on it, Richard, in your keynote, is really key. So the question here is about outdoor dining, bridging a gap for now. The weather is relatively nice. They're not quite so nice where I am today. How do we see? The question here is about restaurants and that economy. I think it probably extends more broadly to, the indoor environment. How are we going to tackle this? Are we going to be coming back to some of these places? We're a social species, so we want to be in contact with each other. Do any of you want to pick up thoughts on that and the innovation needs in that space?
I think a lot of it's about giving people confidence. At the moment, for example, I'm not going to restaurants, right? Because many of the restaurants in the area where I live are not open because they can't work out how to provide the necessary safety and social distancing and still have enough covers to make a profit. And I think this will apply to many indoor activities. So back to something I mentioned earlier, confidence in things like the test, track and trace. Knowing that the risk is there, but it's not a great risk. Finding methods of cleaning and demonstrating the cleaning. Finding methods of controlling the ventilation and demonstrating that you are controlling the ventilation. These kinds of activities. So I think there's an awful lot of things have to be done to create confidence. Some of those will be simple and can be done fairly quickly, but some of them are kind of organizational and structural and will take much longer to bring in. So the evidence from the UK at the moment is that despite the fact that a lot of restaurants have begun to open, is actually the use of them is still pretty low. People are not rushing out in their droves because they've really, really missed going out for a meal. So even the Chancellor's attempt to bribe them with £10 vouchers has not yet had any effect. So there is that confidence that needs to be created.
I think in fairness to the Chancellor, his thing kicks in August, doesn't it? But nonetheless, I definitely share the sentiment. Do either of you guys want to comment on? So one of the things I think we talked about in the report was the use of digital twins and building information models to be able to more easily communicate the cleansing regime and the quality of the air and make that sort of thing more, again, to build trust in some of these spaces we might come into. Tamar, I don't know whether you want to say anything about the use of digital twins to build trust and communicate.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. Some of what Richard described around kind of ventilation systems and how changing them could be structural changes. I think digital twins could be supportive of making buildings safer and making those big changes in a way that is easy to strategize about. I think digital twins could help us strategize about exactly that. The other thing that came to my mind when we were talking about kind of people's use of restaurants as they kind of open just for outside use, I think there have been kind of various efforts to kind of collect the names of people that are actually kind of using the restaurants to dine in, and it feels like a lot of people are much more comfortable with that in the context of the kind of health crisis, and because they want to be contacted if there is an issue, and I think the kind of personal data aspects of that are interesting and kind of challenges that we probably need to work through a little bit, and kind of seeing how people respond to that, and how people, like, trust is really important there as well. Like we probably need people to be sharing that information to manage reopening, and that needs to be kind of carefully done. We need to bring everyone along with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are lots of organizational things which are interesting. So I was listening this morning on the radio to a program called The Long View, and it was talking about the comparison between the plague hitting London in the Shakespearean period and what happened when all the theatres had to close, and what is happening with theatres being closed now. And it was really interesting because one of the things that the government did was indeed they sponsored theatres to keep them open in the Elizabethan period. So this question of how you change an indoor environment. So CIBSE, which is the professional organization for building control systems, has published guidance on what to do with your ventilation system to minimize the risk. And things like don't recycle, set it to 100% fresh air once through, these kinds of things. That raises all kinds of energy efficiency questions. But using the digital twins to be able to predict what happens could be immensely valuable. So people in theatres were saying, well, in a theatre, you're largely kind of sitting, the audience is sitting side by side, and they're not breathing into each other's faces. Whereas if you go to a restaurant, you might well be meeting strangers and meeting them fairly close to, fairly face to face. So understanding, what the risk is and how you would adjust. And the people in the theatre are saying getting a 2 meter, 1.5 meter separation in the theatre means that only 4% of the theatres in the UK could reopen, because it just wouldn't be economically viable otherwise. So I think, using these advanced techniques to be able to think through the risks and work out how to mitigate them is going to be hugely important, because an awful lot of these indoor venues will not be viable if we are stuck with fairly crude and simplistic ways of reducing the risk.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Bob, I want to come to you. There's a question here about high streets, town centres, before the pandemic kicked off, there was already a very active conversation about the future of high streets, the decline of retail, how places might reimagine themselves, might redesign themselves, and this experience has only accelerated that. I think at the same time, as Richard said, we've rediscovered the value of the neighbourhood. I might not want to get on a train to go into London, but I might be happy strolling into something more local, and I'm much more aware of what's in my local area and what assets are available. I wonder if you want to say a few words about what you think what the innovation needs or the changing demands might be around the high street and the town centre.
Sure, yeah, so I think it's, like you say, another one of those shifts which has perhaps been accelerated by the pandemic, but which we were already seeing and people were already grappling with. So the shift to e-commerce, in particular, has huge implications for logistics and distribution, as well as the last mile delivery components. I think Richard was right in the introduction to kind of highlight the huge increase to online deliveries and online grocery shopping. But what I think we also would experienced at the time was the fact that those traditional grocery retailers were not really set up to deliver against that need at the scale that it emerged and as rapidly as it emerged. And that's because the infrastructure for the grocers is obviously set up to deliver products to stores in neighborhoods, and not to deliver products to hundreds of thousands of individual customers. Whereas Amazon and kind of native e-tailers, if you like, have already set up the infrastructure and the huge warehouses that we saw in Richard's example to kind of facilitate that last mile delivery. So in a way, the kind of the mainstream grocery retailers are playing catch up now, and Amazon's purchase of the organic grocer, is an interesting example of them trying to sort of take some of the turf away from the mainstream retailers. But in terms of the implications of that for the built environment, I think some of the obvious ones would be how the streets around where we live are used, and kind of the need for curbside delivery. So we had some of the kind of electric last mile delivery services that Richard referenced. Looking a bit further into the future, then there's obviously an opportunity there for drones and for completely contactless delivery, if you want to think about it in those terms. Then the question becomes, of course, well, where are the drones located? Where are those hubs? How do they actually deliver goods to private residences and to other locations? So I guess that's the retail element to it. But there's also some interesting kind of innovative sort of civic experiments that have been happening, if you like, in regard to public space. So through the lockdown, where we saw, a huge absence of vehicles from our roads, a lot of neighbourhoods have been kind of taking more kind of direct action and control over the space in which they live, and repurposing those roads for play areas, for exercise areas, and other activities. So the question, of course, will be, as we sort of transition away from strict lockdown, which of those more kind of neighbourhoods, socially owned uses of public space can be sustained, and how does that sort of interact with the changes to the transport system that we were discussing earlier?
Very good, thank you. Tamer, I'm going to come to you. So there's a question here about talking about the modeling and the decision-making tools and the twins, digital twins. You know, do we just have the compute power to do the sorts of things we want to be doing? You know, there's big complex interplay of systems. You and I discussed about the digital twins means a million things to, you know, different people. I suppose what's the first next step, perhaps, if we're looking to innovate and turn some of this creative thinking into commercial propositions?
So it's interesting. I think one of the themes that comes through when people discuss digital twins is the kind of systems of systems type thinking, the kind of joint up modeling, like taking lots of things into account at the same time, like looking at transport alongside a disease model, alongside kind of models of how people go shopping and go to work and go to school. And I suppose that's where the compute power considerations kind of really start coming in. There are a few companies that are very successfully innovating around that. So where they're really kind of focusing on how to scale simulations. I can think of a few UK-based companies that are kind of very much focusing on that kind of technology. So I think the opportunity there is perhaps those kind of innovators that are really kind of concentrating on scaling, working with academic groups and groups that are focused on the kind of conceptual modeling side of things to bring that all together, because it's not the expertise of one group, it's a kind of a huge collaborative task. So I think that's where the RAMP project that we mentioned earlier, the Rapid Assistance project, has been really successful, and hopefully things like that can be built on, so that the kind of technologies we need can come together. Then I think perhaps one of the obvious blockers to much kind of that system type digital twin and kind of modeling for decision making thinking is always data access, and we need innovation around data sharing. It doesn't need to be kind of completely open data. We need to be careful about privacy. We need to be kind of considerate of like scaling considerations, but business model innovation around how data are shared is really, really kind of critical, I think, for the development of all of the kind of technologies we're talking about.
Fantastic. Yeah. So there's a question here from Ben. So there's a question. It's really about where the energy for innovation comes from, where the demand comes from. We've got lots of structures in the UK. We've got Whitehall. We've got devolved authorities. We've got combined authorities, LEPs, different layers of administration. Theoretically, we were about to devolve lots of decision making and spending to local authorities through local industrial strategies pre-pandemic, but we've seen a mass centralisation, really, I think, over the last couple of months, with understandable reason. Richard, do you want to reflect a bit on where you see demand and whether we're going to see a return to devolution, or actually are we now centralised for the foreseeable future?
I think the centralization is a kind of immediate panic reaction to quite a complex set of changes. And even that, we've in the UK, we've struggled a little bit with the devolved administrations, with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland taking their own route. But ultimately, a lot of these things can only be solved at the local level. So, for example, if we talked as Bob did about the possibilities of reconfiguring transport to improve air quality, that is only deliverable on a local scale, because it depends on the structure of your city, the road, the routes through it, what you have in the center, what you have in the periphery, its connections with other places, all of these kinds of things. So, for example, Nottingham, has been doing for a long time a major project on how they move transportation to zero carbon, and in particular the public transport. How do they structure that? Electric buses, different routes, different ways of working. Manchester has a strong theme for improved cycling routes. So the solutions ultimately must depend on the specific infrastructure you've got and the specific challenges you face. Central government can encourage, can fund, can maybe suggest good ideas, but the ultimate decisions for many of these things, how, what we're going to do with the high street, how we're going to handle our hospital, these can only be taken on the ground by people in the locality. And so I think, there's an understandable centralization that goes on in the first phase, but as we move into Horizon 2 and start to come out of lockdown, we have to be thinking on a local scale to make it work, because no central organization can actually understand all the different situations.
That's very good. Stay with you on a sort of similar theme. You wrote a piece for us quite early on in the process of lockdown and the pandemic around whether this was going to be a lasting, catalyst of change, or whether this was going to pass and be forgotten. What are you feeling now? It's a couple of months on since you wrote that. Is this going to be a lasting set of changes, or is it still possible that actually much of what we're experiencing now will just fade?
So I think it depends still on how long this lasts and what that Horizon 3 looks like. Do we actually get the vaccine early next year, at the end of this year? Do we have to wait another year for that? Is a vaccine ever found? Do we have to learn to live with it? Because at the moment, as I said, what we've been doing is emergency response with solutions we already have, using them in clever ways, like the 3D printing for PPE. We've been thinking about, as we come out of lockdown, what are the small changes that we can make? But it depends on the same infrastructure. So for instance, I think that this has been a huge boost to contactless shopping, reduction in the use of cash. I don't think that will come back, because people who were maybe resistant have been forced to try it, found that it works fine. Why would they go back? Similarly, I think the boost to online shopping will stick, because if you've tried it and it works and it gives you everything you want and it gives you more time, and you didn't really like shopping anyway, which is true of a lot of us. I mean, shopping as a leisure activity will come back, but shopping for essentials, why would it not go online if people find that it works? So those things where the change was in train and people have, been forced to try, more people have been forced to try and find that it works, that won't go back. Think about those doctors. Those doctors have been hugely resistant to online consultations, suddenly saying, actually, we'd like to keep this for the future because it's really rather convenient and works very well and we get all kinds of benefits. I think the challenge is in those things which do imply changes to the infrastructure, because that means investment, that means time. And the pressure to change has to continue for long enough in order for people to get used to it, to accommodate it, become acclimatized to those chains. So I think the working from home might not be a complete flip, because I think ultimately there will be pressures to get back together again, because it's easier to do creativity, it's easier to do brainstorming, it's easier to do problem solving. So there'll be some shift, but if we continue with COVID for a long time, it will become the norm, and then it will stick. Electric vehicles, clean air, there's lots of pressure from the public, lots of political pressure, if you like, but it's going to take big changes over quite an extended period of time. That could easily go back to the way it was progressively. And already in parts of the UK, we're back to 80% of where we were with road traffic already. So I think that the challenge is, as things become more difficult to change, more investment, more time required, then the COVID crisis has to go longer to force that change. Where the change is quick and was already in train, where we're going with the flow, where the tide was already running, I think those changes will stick.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time, so I'm just going to put one more question, and then I'll try and do a little bit of a sum up. I'm sorry we haven't got through all the questions. We will do a little write-up and reflection on anything we didn't get to, and we'll publish that in the next week or so. So apologies if we didn't get to. Some of you sent some links. We're going to look at those. Some really interesting stuff. Tamer, I'm going to come back to you. There's a question here about data ethics. Obviously, there's a broader conversation about bias and privilege in our wider culture. And there's a risk, obviously, in data as well, that if we start using that increasingly, as I think we see the need and value for in decision making and planning, that we need to think very carefully about ethics and bias in our algorithms. I wonder if you just want to say a few words about the skills or the kind of approaches that we might need to make sure we're including as innovators in grasping these tools, but being mindful of some of the risks they have.
Yep, that's big, Sam. I like it. I think it's super important in kind of on many dimensions. There's certainly a kind of personal data and surveillance angle to things that we need to be very careful of, and there are lots of technological innovations that we can use to help with that, like differential privacy and like new approaches to encryption. Some of the kind of the models that some of the big technology companies have put out around contact tracing using Bluetooth are interesting, and there are kind of emerging models around that we could draw on. There've been some big breaches, haven't there? Like I mean, Twitter was hacked. I woke up to that news this morning, and we've had a couple of incidents with all of them moved to people using GP services online, and a couple of incidents around data breaches there. And it's something that we clearly need to kind of respond to on multiple levels. I think there's being very careful and having a kind of privacy and ethics first approach to the development of new technologies, but then there's also the kind of protection of the technologies that we do have in terms of cybersecurity and techniques like that. So I think we need to see more investment around that, and that seems to be being recognised. So hopefully that will continue to happen. With things like bias, I think that there are known issues around bias in machine learning and artificial intelligence that are kind of actively being researched, and there are kind of some new methods to help with that. There's also like machine learning only looks at data about the past, and that is part of the problem in terms of bias. Simulation and modeling and the kinds of things that we're seeing kind of come to the forefront due to the pandemic, and they're kind of being mainstream media due to the pandemic. They don't have that feature in quite the same way. They're a bit more explainable and transparent, and that can be a really, really positive thing, I think, for making sure that we use data in a way that we understand and that we can control. So yeah, a huge topic, and I'm very passionate about it. So I'll stop there.
Well, lots more to unpack there on a future day. I'm going to pause there. So thank you. Do join me in your respective home offices in thanking our speakers and contributors. I hope you found that stimulating. Thank you for all your questions. As I say, we will endeavour to do a bit of a write-up and share that. We've got a whole array of other webinars and events, thought leadership programme coming up, so do sign up for that. As I say, I'm hosting one next week on post-pandemic mobility, and there's other ones about all manner of different things, opportunities for SMEs, some more global opportunities in Africa, air quality and the like. I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that we're launching a new podcast. This is a new thing for us. This is going to be launching in the next couple of weeks, exploring some of these future of post-pandemic opportunities, looking at the future of the high street, the future of the office, the future of the business district, future transport, with our chair, Professor Greg Clark, and various industry experts and VIPs. So do look out for that. And if you haven't dived into the Innovation Brief material yet, then please go and have a look. There's lots of exciting opportunities. We talked about many of them in mobility, in infrastructure, in how we create indoor venues that work for the new world, in how we reinvent the high streets. And one I'm really interested in is this idea of sort of how we reconfigure our built environments in particular. If Into and these other big box retailers close, how are we going to reimagine and recreate those for the new market opportunities? There's a company in the States I remember reading about who help create infill communities in a similar sort of out of town big box retailers with these acres of concrete for parking, and they made a business out of turning those into whole new villages and towns where the kind of moment for out of town big box things passed. I wonder if there's a similar opportunity now as we reimagine the future of our office towers and our shopping centres for this new world. So thank you all for joining me. There's a few stragglers left, and I look forward to catching up with you hopefully at a future Third Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.